Welcome to History in Lowell. I'm Maritza Grooms. I'm here with my personal professor, Bob Forrant. Hey, Bob.
How are you?
You know, life is crazy, but I'm grateful to be here with you.
Yeah, I know. We've been on hiatus. Is that what they call it on TV? Like we're in season 9 or something.
Yeah.
So we were on hiatus.
Yeah, we
But
took
we're
a
back.
mid-season break.
Right.
Yeah.
We're back. We're back.
You know, we've been doing this for 6 years.
That's pretty amazing.
Facebook told me so.
Oh.
I saw a post from like our very first show, and it was about Black history in Lowell. And I think that's pretty relevant to bring up because we're going to be kind of talking about Black history, maybe not just specifically in Lowell, maybe a little bit in Lowell, but we're going to be talking about kind of what we always talk about, but with a different angle. So the erasure, the watering down, and why history is important and needs to be told.
Yep.
And a little bit about your life, Bob.
Okay, a little bit.
A little bit.
Not too much.
A little.
A little bit.
For
Not
the
too much.
fans.
Yeah, not too much though.
No. So why don't we start there, though? You went to Northeastern, right? And you got there and you were having a great time. You're having a blast, protesting, being a great student, right? And then you found out.
What kind of a great student? Took me a year to find my way.
Well, like all actual great students. It took me maybe several years.
I'll take that, yeah.
Until I found my personal professor. And then you noticed there was something missing from the curriculums. What was it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of it was, so it's the late 60s, and it's really pretty much in the air where with the Vietnam War and the power of the civil rights movement and everything that's going on, and I'm in Boston, and sort of there's an awareness on the part of lots of students that there are gaps in the curriculum. And in some cases, colleges and universities are beginning to be reflective and think about all of that. But, you know, pretty consistently across the board, African American history, women's history, labor history, things like that are not being taught. And there's really a sort of intellectual canon, if you will, a sort of guideline of like what's legit history. And legit history is at that point in the late 60s still largely centered on great men and great white men. And again, within reason, it's changing in some places, but students are, because of everything else that's happening. And there is a moment where colleges and universities are beginning to get a more diverse student population, not like it is today, but definitely it's beginning to happen.
Yeah.
So in Boston at Northeastern or BU or BC or MIT or Harvard or places like that, students are beginning to agitate for more and look at what's missing. And so we start protesting and saying we need this stuff. Our education isn't complete because this is missing. And so around, not just in Boston, but around the country, students are occupying buildings. There's definitely protests around curriculum, around the hiring of a more diverse faculty. We tend to think like DEI initiatives are like a product of 2020 or something.
Yeah.
I mean, we didn't use that phraseology.
Right.
But in effect, that's in a way what we were advocating for, you know, big bunches of students. And there were Black student unions and Black student organizations. And, you know, again, some of it came out of the civil rights movement as well, where agitation around voting rights, around access to education, sort of raised these issues of segregated education, of even though supposedly, you know, separate but equal is gone, well, if you're not represented in the history, what's up? And so to Northeastern's credit, I have to say, they had one of the first African American history courses in the greater Boston area, which I was fortunate enough to take, I think maybe in my 3rd year at Northeastern. And the book that's here, this was the textbook. And so for all of us, it was mind-blowing because there never was an intimation in my earlier education that there was Black history.
Yeah. I mean, why would you think of it if it's not being taught?
And all of a sudden, it's like, wait, there's a textbook? And there's this guy, John Hope Franklin, who teaches at a college. And the professor, a gentleman by the name of Donald Jacobs, invited Mr. Franklin to come to Northeastern and give a lecture. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, this is the smartest person in the country with knowledge of this history, and he's standing there in front of me.
Ooh, I have chills.
So yeah, I think in a way it sort of, it rooted in me, and it's like part of the way I still think, in terms of trying to always look at, okay, what's left out. And he was just this amazing, I mean, you know, he passed away only recently. I mean, he lived a really long and full life. And that was a class where I read W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction, which is still the best book, I think, ever written on Reconstruction after the Civil War.
Ooh, I think that's on my list.
Sort of like, I knew Du Bois and sort of like, you know, like his place in history, but I didn't think of him because I never had been introduced to him as a quote-unquote scholar. Come to find out, he's the first African-American to get a PhD from Harvard.
Harvard, yeah.
And his response when he got it was, Harvard was lucky to have me.
Yes. I love that.
Which I think is pretty cool. But his book, and then we read this book by a historian by the name of Herbert Aptheker, and it was called Negro Slave Revolts. And it was a whole book about rebellions against the institution of slavery from the Caribbean and in the South. And it was the same way, because when I had been taught this history in elementary school and middle school and high school, I thought everybody was happy.
Right, and docile. Nobody's rebelling. You only hear, even today, you really only hear about Nat Turner and Toussaint. Like, you don't hear that there were many rebellions. I still don't even know. And now I'm going to put that in
Herbert Aptheker, American Negro Slave Revolts. And again, it was like, oh, come on now. This is insane. And again, I'm thinking I'm hot stuff. I'm like a history major in college. And it's like, whoa, there's so much I have no clue about.
Oh my
It's very, it was humbling, but it was also you know, it helped me to try to think about, okay, well, if people don't see themselves reflected in the narrative, then sort of what are we left with? And you know, it brings us up to everything we've been trying to do with this program and trying to introduce the history, the documentary we made, all of it, right, is really sort of, I feel like it's still all connected back to this one day when John Hope Franklin walked into a history class I had at Northeastern University. So the book has gone through several printings. I don't know what edition this one is. Eighth. So, but it's just, when you read it, it's like, wait, every other page is like, I never heard of this. How come I don't know about this? Right.
And here we are in 2023. Asking kind of the same questions. How come we don't know about this? Even I'm as a person who like is asking the same questions you're asking now as a student of yours, I'd like to think.
We're students of each other.
Because you challenge me to think bigger and broader and what's missing. And I'm looking at this from slavery to freedom thinking, I only just learned because we were reading on Juneteenth but what's her name? Annette Gordon Reed? That there were free people, free African Americans, free Black people here during the time of slavery. There were free Black people living in Lowell.
John Levy.
Boom.
Free Black man from the Caribbean living in Lowell, and one of the leaders in Lowell of the Underground Railroad and
abolition
and one of the people that Frederick Douglass knew when he came to town, and William Lloyd Garrison and other freedom seekers as they came through, and who knew? He's got an autobiography co-authored with him by his daughter, Life and Adventures of John Levy, edited by his daughter, Miss Rachel Frances Levy, 1871. I
didn't even realize it until you pointed that out.
There it is.
There it is. Why are we still in 2023 having to continue the fight that you guys were fighting in the 60s?
We see it reflected right now there's been this whole thing in the last few weeks even, as we were thinking about today's show, with the advanced placement courses, the college advanced placement tests and things, and basically people have been working for years because there's not an African-American advanced placement history course.
Which just sounds ridiculous considering.
And so people have been working on it for a really long time. But as it came close to running it out, for whatever reason, the people in New York that do the AP curriculum decided they wanted to check in with the state of Florida about what was going to be in the curriculum. And Florida began pushing back on the content about what to teach and not to teach. They didn't want anything, they didn't want certain topics and certain authors included in the curriculum. And while the curriculum people, the scholars who were developing the curriculum, were advancing their ideas behind the scenes, the people employed in AP testing in New York and all were compromising with the state of Florida to ultimately take certain things out of the curriculum, certain people, certain writers, somebody like Ta-Nehisi Coates, people that have written about intersectionality, other topics, reparations, things that the education community in Florida didn't want in the curriculum are now sort of, in some cases, they've either been dropped entirely or they're like special units you can teach if you want to, but they're not part of the curriculum. And when in February, when they announced the advanced placement course, they basically said, no, Florida hadn't influenced what we did. But then it came out through the emails and whatnot that in fact that had happened, and it got me to thinking. And then there was a really brilliant essay editorial in the New York Times by Henry Louis Gates, who's a professor at Harvard, where he sort of went through this narrative about how similar things happened in the 20s and 30s, where there were people in the South who wanted to control the narrative around the Civil War and Reconstruction, and didn't want certain parts of the history taught, wanted things left out, and had such great sort of outsized influence over what got taught that the curriculum got madly changed and things got left out. And so again, Reconstruction, Black Reconstruction, sort of again what Du Bois wrote about and what other scholars were writing about, just got dropped by the wayside. And the history that got taught was largely one of, as you said, docile, happy people that got 3 square meals a day and a place to live. And that really influenced how in the 50s and 60s most people got that history. And he was connecting sort of that in the 1920s to what's happening today.
Well, it's just eerily relevant and scary.
Yep.
And how are we in an age where books are being banned, history is being watered down? Why are we going backwards? And why is this allowed? Who has actual control here, and why are they doing this? Like, these are all questions that I'm constantly asking myself.
Carter Woodson, who's a Harvard-trained historian, is the person who's like considered the godfather of Black History Month. Sort of comes from him, again, thinking, right? And he basically writes and says, starting after the Civil War, the opponents of freedom and social justice decided to work out a program which would enslave the Negro's mind. This is him now, Carter Woodson. It was well understood that if by teaching of history the white man could be further assured of his superiority and the Negro could be made to feel that he had always been a failure and that the subjugation of his will to some other race is necessary, the freed man then would still be a slave. This is Carter Woodson in 1926. When he's saying we need to teach this. And so in opposition is this woman, Mildred Rutherford, who is the historian general of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. She's the person that wants to, and she creates, she writes an essay called A Measuring Rod to Test Textbooks and Reference Books in Schools, Colleges, and Libraries. And it becomes the Bible of dissecting whether books will pass muster and be allowed in Southern schools. And the whole roadmap, the whole test, is how Reconstruction is taught, how slavery is taught. And she says, reject a book that calls the Confederate soldier a rebel and the war a rebellion. Reject a book that says the South fought to hold on to their slaves.
Oh my gosh.
And so, yeah, I mean, it's like, wait.
No wonder that they're still not over it.
Reject a book that speaks of the slaveholder of the South as cruel and unjust.
Get out
Okay.
of here.
Yeah, and then this is the beauty. Reject a textbook that glorified Abraham Lincoln and vilifies Jefferson Davis, unless a truthful cause can be found for such glorification and vilification. Slavery, this is what she says how slavery should be taught. This was an education that taught the Negro self-control, obedience, perseverance, taught him to realize his weaknesses and how to grow stronger for the battle of life.
Ooh, Mildred.
The institution of slavery as it was in the South, far from degrading the Negro, was fast elevating him above his nature and race. This is her in this test. And if you're not teaching this, the truth must be told, and you must read it and be ready to answer it. Unless this is done in a few years, there will be no South about which to write history.
Wow.
So, yep.
Wow.
Holding on to place, I mean, this is really, yeah, I mean, then you have, so this is, in Gates' piece, he concludes with a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, and King says, "No society can fully repress an ugly past when the ravages persist into the present." And then he talks about, King talks in this sermon about teaching the history, all the good, the bad, and you know, the indifferent of it all, but you have to teach it.
Yeah.
The sort of, the conversation we're having is to take this stuff out.
It's so wild to me. Ignorance begets ignorance, because it just feels like that lady and her ideas are exactly how folks are functioning today.
Yep.
But it also reveals how much not only were Black folks not allowed to read and educate themselves, but clearly this is detrimental to everybody.
Sure.
Because when you revise history and you make it seem like enslaved folks were, oh, I can't even,
Yeah.
So, wow, she says some things. Just happy to be there and better off, and taught self-control and all of those things. You make it seem like, what does that mean today?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you treat people?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you even seek to, you know, build communion with your fellow man?
Right.
And how can humanity move forward if we can't even get the facts straight?
Right. I mean, and that's how we get what we get, right? In terms of the justifications for the, you know, police action we see and you know, other situations, right? I mean, it just festers. And, you know, Woodson says in this document, as he's talking about Black History Month, if you can control a man's thinking, I mean, forgive me for using man and not more. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm reading his quote. If you can control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his action.
Yeah.
Right? And so, again, like, she understands what she's doing. If you can control the story, if you can leave people out, if people don't see their presence and don't see their contribution and don't see their struggle and don't see the ways that they navigate and what they do, then yeah, and you know, we just end up with this completely skewed, and I love the name, the Historian General of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. I mean, damn.
Get out of here.
The Historian General, right?
Like, she probably gave herself that title.
Yeah, I mean, but the Daughters of the Confederacy was a really powerful organization during this period of time. I mean, there was a really famous incident where the very incredibly talented singer Marian Anderson was going to sing at the Lincoln Memorial, and basically the Daughters of the Confederacy got it blocked.
Wow.
You know, they didn't want a Black person singing there.
Of course.
And so these things, and so the advanced placement course becomes, what's happened is the idea of teaching this stuff now is a political football embedded in, you know, people flipping around the term wokeness and all this other stuff. And we're right. We're actually regressing.
Yeah, it's really scary. Like, I hear woke propaganda now all the time, and I'm just like, it's not propaganda. It's actual history, and it also brings to mind why segregation even happened in the first place. Because when you sit down and have a conversation with another human, you realize you have more in common than you do that's different. And maybe you're able to see the humanity. And I guess that's also where phrases like, well, you're not like those other ones comes from. But when you're able to have a dialogue, an informed dialogue, then you start asking questions about why are things the way they are. And when you keep people repressed, you keep people ignorant, then they'll vote in your favor. They don't even realize that they're voting against themselves.
Or they don't vote at all because they don't feel like it's going to mean anything. Whereas if you actually had a history of Reconstruction to show that black people were elected to Congress in the 1870s before segregation was reinstituted and you know, violence in the KKK kept people from going to the polls and registering to vote, then no, in fact,
that sounds like a far-fetched story.
things were happening. Things were happening to the good, and changes were being made slowly, but changes were being made, and then everything took a step backwards. But that's why if you don't teach, that's why, you know, books about Reconstruction are so important, because they give the lie to, you know, that black people needed the institution of slavery to keep them in check, and you know that people didn't want education. I mean, the backbone of a lot of civil rights struggle has been access to education. And yet people will still talk about how, well, you know, they don't want to go, you know, whenever I hear somebody say they don't, it's like, okay, like, let's stop there. But, you know, Gates makes the point, and I mean, I think Franklin does in the book, and I can remember when he came to speak, that what happens is if you distort the story, then you miss, as Gates says in the New York Times piece, and Franklin says, the intellectual content of sort of the black debate, that you only think of that history in one way, and so you forget that W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington are living at the same time and are two black intellectuals who have very different perspectives on what they think ought to happen. And so if you drop that out of the AP test, or you don't teach that, again, you end up with this really overly simplified, all black people think the same way. Right? As if all white people think the same way. But you know, that's what you do. And so you forget there are people who are talking about integration, but then there's also Marcus Garvey, who basically his movement is the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which is all about raising money to basically have everybody leave and go back to Africa. And, you know, he's a dominant figure in the middle of the 20th century, sort of making this case. If you don't teach the full complement of the story, you just end up with these really weird histories, and so you pick
one-sided and like watered down, like how everybody thinks MLK was just this peace and love guy, like, but they don't read his more radical stuff, or even MLK and Malcolm X. We don't even get taught about Malcolm X, but then you find out later that they kind of later in their lives, or at the point that they kind of started like sharing ideologies or switching even to the other person's viewpoint. You don't know the debates that they had. Or one of my favorite interviews I've ever listened to or read was Audre Lorde and James Baldwin. And you don't even know about talk about intersectionality. You have a queer black man and a queer black woman. And the conversation that was happening, it kind of also felt like some of the conversations I've had today, but you don't hear about those things. And so you don't know that these nuanced things were happening in history, and that they're part of your history. They're part of our history.
And even if you read Baldwin, if you're fortunate enough to find a high school where you might read something these days by him, nobody really talks about his sexuality. And nobody talks about he had to end up living in France because he couldn't take it anymore. Right? And so you just treat him as, you know, if you're fortunate, you might get him as an icon of writing, but you don't see him as a whole person. So in the AP test, to leave out things like talking about reparations, to leave out things like sort of these intersections of race, sex, and class, and not teach how that forms identity, not, you know, for everybody. And so how, you know, and the fear there's still this sort of weird, I mean, I guess as a historian, I don't completely understand it, but this fear that if people know the whole story, somehow, like, you know, they'll change or something, right? Well, that's the point of teaching, right? I mean, and so then, so what are you afraid of? If you think you're right, you should be willing to contest your ideas.
Exactly. Stand on what you know.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking about this the other day. I'm teaching immigration history this semester, and we were talking about the intersection of immigration history and race, and how in the 1920s in America, there was this big move to limit immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. And from Southern Europe, it was largely based on the fact that they're not white. They're swarthy.
Oh, yes, swarthy.
From Greece and Italy, right?
Oh,
and
gosh.
sort of, again, this kind of an intersection. But eventually in the 50s and 60s, we play off Black people against Italians and Greek immigrant communities and whatnot to try to divide people.
Yeah.
And people don't see their commonality. And at the time when people are so down on immigrants coming from like Portugal and Greece and Italy, places, lots of people coming to New England from those countries, they basically will castigate all those folks as not white.
Yeah. Which is outrageous and insane now to think about.
Yep.
And people forget what it's like because they forget that they had to come from, even here in Lowell, we've gone through each group that came through and then we're treated like dirt. How they treated the Irish laborers here, all kinds of stuff. We know. And if you don't know, you should go back and watch more history in Lowell. But because we talk about this and we try to give a platform, I think, to those groups that often get erased by history. And you and I both are doing work in the background to try to get more stories told and brought forward. And I think, thank goodness for people like us. We have so much to continue your fight from the 60s.
Yeah, here we go, right?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you're still here to lead the way.
Yeah, I mean, we're fortunate in Lowell to, at this point, have the Center for Lowell History, which is part of the university library system, because Martha Mayo, who had been the longtime archivist historian at the Center for Lowell History, did a lot to collect a lot of these stories. And so a lot of the documentary that we did sort of in a way came out of her head, of her collecting things that were there that we could find. And she puts a lot of this stuff up in social media these days. And so a lot of that ended up being used in the signage project, which hopefully will start to appear at some point around the city, that has a lot of the Black history of Lowell out and about in a way that's more visible, so young people and old people like me can actually see it. And so I think we're making progress. Too slow, no question about it. But we do have things like John Levy. We have this is something from the Center for Lowell History, Black and Anti-Slavery History of Early Lowell. Which is like a Lowell history before the Civil War. And then we have, these are selected sermons that were given from churches in Lowell. Eden Foster, who was an abolitionist minister in Lowell, spoke out in the mid-1850s, 1854, against the Kansas-Nebraska Act and opening up more territory to the institution of slavery, and his sermons are here in this book.
Wow.
So people can't say they can't, it's not available, they can't find it if they don't want it. Email me. I'll be happy to share.
It's so important. And I guess we'll end with something that I usually say and haven't said in a while. Read books, people. They're trying to take them away. So if they're trying to take something away, that usually means something's good in them.
Yes, read books.
Keep seeking information, keep asking questions from people like Bob, maybe me, because I'm learning. And we're doing the best that we can, and we're going to keep trying to bring that history forward on this show, History in Lowell. Thanks for tuning in.